Shabbat Shalom. So good to see so many of you here today. I think we hear the rain outside again. Today we are remembering. As our Maftir reading admonished us to do, we are to remember what Amalek did. Back in Exodus chapter 17, out of absolutely nowhere, Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Pick some men for us and go out and do battle with Amalek." Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek. Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. When Moses held his hand up, Israel prevailed. But when his hands grew heavy, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, because when his hands went down, Amalek prevailed. While Aaron and Hur supported Moses' hands, he remained steady until the sun set, and Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. God says, "I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." But at the same time, we hear that God is at war with Amalek throughout the ages. We are told, remember what Amalek did, and also blot out the name of Amalek. How do we do both? Seems a fitting prelude to Purim, which is a dizzying, tipsy, even inebriated time, where up is down and down is up. It's fitting to feel a little bit turned around when we read these portions. Was Amalek wiped out, or is it an entity with whom we and God do continual battle? As was pointed out in Torah study the other day by Pablo, it's a conditional blotting out of Amalek's name. We're only supposed to do so when we're settled and the enemies around us have been vanquished. It's a time of peace. And so there's something strange, something odd about this command. When we're at peace, we should go to war? Or maybe reading a little deeper, when we're at peace, we should give ourselves a break from doing battle with this Amalek that came from behind and cut down the stragglers, the weak and the weary, as Moses says in Deuteronomy, expanding a little more, as is not uncommon in Deuteronomy, giving some different facets, different details, leaving out others than the accounts in the earlier parts of the Torah. We get a little more of the psychology of what was happening at that attack back in Exodus, when we hear in Deuteronomy, they attacked you from the rear guard. Ostensibly, where the women, the elderly, the children, the disabled were. But again, there too, there's more to that. Reading through a modern lens, and it actually isn't so modern. It's been around at least 1,000 years and maybe older than that. Reading this idea of Amalek as this force that comes when our guard is down. When we're not being so vigilant, we're reminded by the Torah and by Moses' teachings to be wary of Amalek, that force that comes to bite us in the rear, as it were, when we are not being so vigilant, when we think we've got it all figured out, or maybe when we're weary and we reach for things and behaviors and go down paths we know we shouldn't go down because they're going to hurt us deeply. Maybe that's the impulse that God is continuing to do battle with, and that we know we ourselves have to remember what Amalek did and also somehow work to blot out that memory. And while we're at it, we're told, don't forget. It's enough to make you a little tipsy. My colleague, Rabbi Peretz Wolf-Pruzan, one of the Torah columnists for the J, summarized some of the teachings on Amalek very nicely in his piece on Shabbat Zachor for this week's J. So I appreciate that Rabbi Peretz put some of the traditional teachings about Amalek in one place. Now, why do we read about Amalek right before Purim? It's a little bit of a tenuous connection. maybe not as tenuous as looks on the surface, but you dig a little deeper, it's a little tenuous. But Haman, boo, right? We need to practice, warm up for Monday evening, thank you. Haman is said to be, in our Megillah, a descendant of the Agagites. Haman the Agagite. And we read at the end of the Haftarah today that King Agag was the king of the Amalekites. Haman is not specifically named as an Amalekite, but rather an Agagite. And there are other ancient versions of the Megillah in other languages that actually say he came from another ethnic group. So it's not across the board. But the Jewish version, the canonized Jewish version of the Megillah, of the Scroll of Esther, says that Haman is a descendant of that king Agag, that at the end of the Haftarah, Samuel the prophet kills, not King Saul, but Samuel the prophet. We don't think of our prophets usually as picking up swords and doing away with people, but in the book of Samuel, that is one of the functions he serves. It's a painful but really dramatic moment. So that King Agag is ostensibly an ancestor of Haman. Although there are people that question, well, how could there have been any descendants of Agag? Everyone else was wiped out, and the rabbis come to fill that in. They say, well, you see, in the time that he was in jail, he must have had some conjugal visits, and therefore sired some ancestors that would come after him, or sired some progeny that would come after him. But okay, either way, Haman is described as an Agagite, and this perpetual foe that comes to attack us, the rabbis of the Talmud, so now we're talking almost 2,000 years ago, were deeply disturbed by these verses. So if you find yourself a little undone by these verses, know you are not alone. Okay? The rabbis were equally unsettled at this notion that we would be in a perpetual battle with Amalek. How could we tell who the Amalekites were? Actually, even back in Isaiah chapter 10, Isaiah writes, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, had come up already and confused all the lands, as it is said, I've removed the bounds of the people. So it was impossible to identify who was an Amalekite. So even should we think we've come across one, we could never be sure, and so they should be left alone. But also the Talmud in Sanhedrin 96b says, the descendants of Haman studied Torah in Bnei Brak, and they included Rabbi Shmuel ben Shilat. So already the rabbis of almost 2,000 years ago were trying to rehabilitate the image of Haman and his descendants. In the Talmud tractate Brachot 10a, Beruria, one of the few women mentioned in the Talmud, and she is a great Talmudic teacher, very few women, almost none, she's rather singular. Beruria says that it is only the sins of Amalek that must be removed, not the Amalekites themselves. So we should look to rehabilitate behavior. In Maimonides' Laws Concerning the Sabbath, Maimonides writes that the lowest expression of human behavior is vengeance, and the highest expression is ethics. He wrote, there is no vengeance in the commandments of the Torah, only compassion, mercy, and peace in the world. How could we identify an Amalekite and continue to do battle with them? Does Amalek rather live within us? The forces that say, come, follow me. I will lead you down a good path where you will feel good and indulge your whims and wishes. What could be wrong with it? Maybe that's the Amalek with which we are to do battle. And that idea goes all the way back to the Zohar, to the mystical teachings of at least 700 years ago, and possibly even longer ago. But today is also a day for remembering, not just rehabilitating. And I feel a responsibility to acknowledge the Amalekite behavior that is very much among us today and far too in vogue. And so I want to pay tribute to a Purim that was described by Rabbi Joachim Prinz. He was a German-American rabbi and activist. He was a leading proponent of Zionism and civil rights. Rabbi Prinz lived from 1902 to 1988, and I apologize in advance for bringing into our Shabbat space the name of perhaps the most heinous example of Amalekite behavior in human history. Rabbi Prince's writing, among many other pieces of writing, was called A Rabbi Under the Hitler Regime, Yimach Shemo. Rabbi Prince describes a Purim that I would like us to remember on this Shabbat Zachor. Rabbi Prince wrote, I left Germany in 1937. I was expelled in July of 37, and therefore I can only report about the years between 1933 and 1937. It's difficult to lump the years together. There were dynamic developments, both in terms of the events and the reaction of the people. In those days, we read the prayer book in terms of our daily experience, and we understood why we responded so readily. Many of the prayers had been written in the medieval context of persecution, and even the Psalms spoke about the table prepared in the presence of my enemies. We were surrounded. Many stories of the Bible began to make sense or had new and different meaning. The story of David and Goliath became a story of hope. If he could slay the giant man, maybe so could we, in the end, be victorious over the giant people who called themselves supermen of a super race. Jewish holidays, too, assumed new importance. No longer were they perfunctory observances of the day. They became part of the context of danger, fear, and hope in which we lived. One of the most important holidays was, of course, Purim. People came by the thousands to the synagogue to listen to the story of Haman and Esther. This, too, was the story of our own lives. It was quite clear to us that Haman meant Hitler. The Megillah, which was read in Hebrew and translated, suddenly made sense. It was again the story of our lives. When Haman's plot was announced, it bore a strange resemblance to Hitler's plot to wipe out the Jewish people. Many came to ask me if Hitler was aware of the story of Haman. It was so identical with his own designs for the Jewish people. Then the turning point came. Haman was demasked and exposed to disgrace and death. Never had I heard such applause in a synagogue when the names of the 10 sons of Haman were read, describing their hanging from the gallows. Every time we read the name of Haman, the people heard Hitler, and the noise was deafening. The little noisemakers, which had become part of the Purim festival, were so much more than toys. They were the instruments of a demonstration in the midst of despair. Outside in the streets and in the homes, no one could speak against Hitler. But here in the synagogue, there was no limit to our rejection. No one, no matter how sensitive, minded, or objected to the passages of revenge, which in a climate of peace and equality seemed to have no place in Jewish life. When the story of Purim is much more than just a story, when we hear in it frightening echoes of times in which we live, it is that much more incumbent upon us to remember what Amalek did, and work, as Rabbi Peretz says, to call out Amalekite thinking wherever we see it, harness the strength of Esther, the courage of Mordechai, to go forward and say, this will not stand. As a human race, we are better than this. We all have Amalekite tendencies within us. Call them out. Bring them to light. Remind each and every one of ourselves that we are like the Ner Tamid, which is mentioned so beautifully in this week's Parsha, made only with olive oil, pressed and pressed until it brings forth its most sweet and delectable nectar to keep that Ner Tamid burning within ourselves, within our communities, within our world. We can do this. Let us be the light. Let us not turn toward the darkness of Amalek. Remember what was done, and let's work together to keep it from ever happening again. Shabbat Shalom.